Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tisch College's Civic Life Lunch, Rural Organizing, Fighting for Change in Trump Country. My name is Matt Hildreth, and I'm a senior in the School of Arts and Sciences studying economics. I'm originally from Nashville, Tennessee, so I'm very much looking forward to hearing what our guest has to say today. Before we get started, I want to thank our wonderful co-sponsors, Jumbo Vote and the Tufts Political Science Department, for their support and collaboration on today's event and so many others throughout the semester. We are so grateful for your partnership. Speaking of Jumbo Vote, if you haven't registered to vote yet, or you've yet to request your absentee ballot, head to vote.tufts.edu to do that before your state's registration deadline, many of which are today or later this week. Today's deadlines include the states of Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Hawaii, Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee. So definitely get on that if you haven't yet. Tisch College has many events and civic leaders visiting campus virtually this fall. Tomorrow at noon, we will host U.S. States Congressman Joe Kennedy III. And on Wednesday, we will chat with Professor Cheryl Laird, who will talk about how social forces shape Black political behavior. You can find more information and register for these opportunities by visiting tischcollege.tufts.edu/events. I also wanted to remind folks in the Zoom room that there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions for our speaker throughout the event. Keep an eye on the chat for instructions from Tisch College staff on just how you can do that. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Matt Hildreth. Matt Hildreth is the Executive Director of ruralorganizing.org, a national organization working for progressive change in rural America. Hildreth grew up on a small farm in eastern South Dakota and is a graduate of Bethel University in St. Paul, Minnesota, where he studied philosophy and communications. He earned a master's degree in strategic communication from the University of Iowa and holds an executive education certificate from Harvard University's Leadership, Organizing, and Action program. For nearly a decade, Hildreth's work has focused on leveraging digital technologies to motivate key constituencies towards greater civic engagement on issues related to migration and social cohesion. Before he led ruralorganizing.org, Matt served as the digital director, political director, and the director of new initiatives at America's Voice, where he led a team dedicated to fighting white nationalism and white supremacy online, offline, and in politics. And before that, he spent 3 years at the interactive media producer for Sojourners, the largest network of progressive Christians in America, where he developed innovative techniques for engaging online constituents. Joining Matt Hildreth in conversation today is Jess Burns, program administrator at Tisch College, who manages all of the Tisch College guest events, such as this one. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Matt Hildreth and Jess Burns.
Well, thank you, Matt Tolbert, for that introduction and for the critical work that you do with Jumbo Vote and the Andrew Goodman Foundation to prepare the Tufts community and beyond for political participation in this upcoming election and every election. We appreciate so much all that you do. And thank you to our other Matt Hildreth, for joining us today. We're so thrilled that you could participate. So for today's format, we're going to start today's conversation with some questions of my own, as well as some that were submitted by students prior to the event. Then we'll move on to Q&A with our audience later. But first, Matt, I think some people, particularly progressives on the coasts, tend to assume that rural America is disproportionately conservative or supportive of President Trump. What does that actually look like on the ground? And what are some of the ideas or values that have drawn a lot of rural folks to the GOP? And what can we learn from that?
Yeah, well, first off, I just want to say thank you for having me. I'm excited to be a part of this conversation, and thank you for elevating rural issues through your programming. I think that really makes a difference, and that's something that we appreciate at ruralorganizing.org, but I know rural people across the country, regardless of what side of the political aisle they're on, appreciate. So thank you for that. I think your question is there's kind of a simple answer, and then I think there's a much more complicated answer. The simple answer is, yeah, rural people tend to be more conservative and identify, especially in terms of their identity, more as conservative or moderate, and that's something that we have especially seen in the last couple decades. But the interesting thing for me is looking back, especially having grown up in South Dakota, looking back at the early progressive movements of the early 1900s and seeing where progressive ideas came from. They came from the prairies, they came from the plains, they came from Appalachia. And there's a strong connection between progressive values and the prairie populace or the coal miners in Appalachia. And I think that that's something progressives have really forgotten in the last couple decades. And we've just kind of assumed, there's this assumption that people have that in the inner city, core are the most progressive people. And the further you get out from that, the more conservative that you get. And that's actually not the case. And that's not been my own personal experience, but that's also the polling that we have really reinforces that as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. So in talking about some of the work that you and your team do at ruralorganizing.org, can you talk about some of the barriers to organizing for candidates or causes on either side of the aisle in rural areas? Like what are some of the biggest challenges that you and your team face?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because with COVID, it seems that everything's a challenge. But for us, the reason that we have .org in our organizational name is because when we started this project, we really realized there was a vacuum in rural communities that could be addressed through online technology. And so we are an online network, and we're an online network on purpose because the definition of rural means remote in many cases and distance. And so physical geography is always the #1 challenge for rural organizing. If you're organizing in a more dense community population-wise, it's easy to contact 30 people in a half an hour. But in rural communities, contacting 30 people could take all day. And so I think that's why there's been a bit of a neglect among rural voters, just because without digital technologies, it's been a real challenge. I will say the Trump campaign in 2016 realized that as well. If you look at how they organized themselves and how they engaged rural voters, they primarily did it through Facebook. They primarily did it through social media. Obviously, cable news is another component of that as well. But I think that that's something where the Republicans and the Trump campaign were ahead of Democrats. Of course, we have broadband issues, and I think we can maybe talk about that in a bit. But there still are a number of people because of specific campaigns to bring broadband to rural communities that were successful. There's a number of people that have better internet connectivity actually in rural areas than they do in urban areas. I'm in Columbus, Ohio right now. I just moved from a rural community in Iowa a couple of years ago, and I had fiber optics going straight into my basement in rural Iowa. And here in Columbus, it seems like my internet cuts out every other day. So that's, I think, one of the big challenges that we see. And then another challenge is the stereotypes. I mean, at the end of the day, I think one of the #1 things that are hurting rural voters are stereotypes. And what happens is the people that are running campaigns, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, tend to have stereotypes about rural voters. And so they're actually engaging voters based on their stereotypes, rather than any sort of real lived experience. And I think that's something that we see time and time again. So Democrats tend to think that rural voters are all, Trump voters, or they're all sort of locked in on the Republican Party. So they just have kind of walked away and given up. And if you look on the Republican side, I think most Republicans think rural voters are all white, racist, and conservative, and so they perpetuate those stereotypes through their messaging. And what we find is actually rural voters are swing voters, and we find that rural voters feel alienated from the political process, and so that alienation has really led to some resentment and unaddressed grievances. And so rather than actually addressing those grievances and actually developing an agenda for rural people, it's just campaigns talking past people. And I think that's something that we're fundamentally seeing right now as we head into to the final stretch of this election cycle.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm thinking, back to your comment about, in urban areas, it's easier to, whether you're door to door, knocking for a candidate, it's easier to hit a lot of houses quickly versus, in rural areas, you'd be lucky to maybe hit 30 voters in a day. So has COVID in a way, not to imply that there's sort of any good outcome of COVID, but how has that changed your team's tactics?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think our team was one of the first teams to be sort of to pivot within those first weeks in March and April. And that was because we had an event actually that was in mid-March, and that was the first event we canceled after COVID. It was a meetup for Appalachia organizers in the Ohio River Valley, and we had to pivot to an online meeting, a Zoom meeting. And I'll never forget it. I mean, prior to that meeting, it was impossible to get our network to connect with each other. If there was an option to meet in person, everybody said, well, we can't ever really, have an effective conversation online. We need to meet in person, and we have to see each other. We have to be in the same room. And that just the logistics of getting, people from a 9-state or 12-state region together was just really hard. And then we had that meeting, and it went actually pretty well, and we actually were able to get more participants. And since then, whether it's because of church or because of classes, everybody knows how to Zoom now, and so that really has helped us in the COVID era. It's really helped move our network into connection with each other, and it's really helped overcome that geographical divide.
I'm muted. That I was saying, thank you for that answer, and it sort of beautifully segues to my next question. So at Tisch College, we are lucky to have several research centers, and 2 of which focus on the civic and political engagement of young people. So a few years ago, some of our researchers coined the term civic deserts to describe parts of the country, especially in rural areas where there's a lack of infrastructure and opportunities for people, particularly younger people, to become engaged civically. Do you see that in some of the communities that you work in, and what kinds of consequences does that have?
Absolutely. And in fact, we have taken that research, the civic deserts, and specifically incorporated those findings into our ongoing theory of change. And to the point where I actually don't think you can understand rural communities and rural issues without understanding this concept of civic deserts. So that has been fully integrated into our work. It's one of the reasons I was excited to get in as a part of this conversation, is because that research has been so much a piece of shaping our understanding over the last couple of years. And I will say we actually did an entire project in Kansas this year. It's still ongoing, but the fundamental question we were looking to answer was around civic deserts, and how do you, what can you do as an organization or an issue or a cause or campaign? What can you do to take your community from 0 to 1, from absolutely no civic infrastructure to getting involved? And that was something, all of our campaigns, we try and learn from them. We don't want to just change policy or politics. We actually want to learn. And that, I think the findings that we have from that that are coming out of that project have been really interesting, especially when you compare it to the research you're mentioning.
Yeah, and thank you for the kind words for our researchers. I'm sure they will love to hear that. So there's a question in the Q&A from someone from Ohio that I think actually touches on what you were just talking about in your last answer really well. So they say, as someone from Columbus, Ohio, this election cycle, Ohio has painted as less of a swing state and more firmly red. Why do you think this is, and how can progressives engage with the issues that rural Ohioans care about?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think if you look at the swing Ohio took in 2016, it would be hard to think of Ohio as a swing state after that. And then also 2018 was not a great cycle for Ohio as well for Democrats. And so I think those 2 things together made people really just assume that the change that we were seeing was long term. But I think that gets to the kind of the stereotype that I mentioned before. It's actually rural voters. An interesting finding, we did a massive survey of 7,000 rural battleground voters, and in many rural or in many battleground states, I'm not sure if this is true for Ohio, but it's especially true in Georgia, North Carolina, I think Ohio to a certain extent, Black Lives Matter protesters are actually more popular than the Democratic Party, but the Republican Party hardly breaks 50% as well. So rural voters actually feel ignored by both parties, and I especially think that played out in Ohio with Trump. It wasn't that Trump was a Republican, so they were voting for him. It was that Trump was sort of a wrecking ball, that, you know, they felt like the entire system, mainly I think because of these civic deserts, people feel disconnected from institutions making decisions about their lives. And they voted in, you know, they kind of knew it was a crazy Hail Mary pass. And so they kind of went with it. And Trump convinced them, you know, this idea of draining the swamp. Rural voters are very anti-corruption, very anti-corporate, actually. And Donald Trump tapped into that messaging. If you look at the ads Trump is running in Ohio right now, it's all about how Joe Biden's going to end Social Security and Joe Biden's going to end Medicare. So Trump is actually running on Democratic issues in Ohio, like as we speak. And that was something that I think Trump effectively did, is he created an agenda that wasn't just a traditional Republican agenda. It was a Republican sort of brand, but then it was all about Social Security. It was all about increasing people's wages, decreasing their daily expenses. And then he, of course, inserted racism into that messaging. I think that was something that where he miscalculated rural voters a little bit. But I think, you know, the voters have have learned in Ohio, and I think people feel like, you know, nothing's getting better here, and so they took a risk on Trump, and I think now that they're kind of turning away from that. Rural issues specifically in Ohio, and that I think Democrats could really capitalize on are healthcare. Healthcare is always a top issue for rural voters. And that's also true with COVID. We think that, I think those state protests, those state house protests that we saw back in the spring and summer, where people were showing up at the Ohio State House saying, open back up, we open back up, don't shut down our economy, really led the media to believe that rural people were not concerned about COVID. That's not the case. Three out of 4 rural voters in Ohio and other battleground states are very concerned about COVID. And they're actually more concerned about COVID spreading at schools and universities than they are about the economic shutdowns. And so because of COVID, I mean, everything is COVID this year. Because of healthcare, we know that the Supreme Court is going to consider decisions that would take away Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. And so I think that's one of the really main issues. And I'll just to piggyback on that, one of the stereotypes that we see a lot about rural people is like they're all farmers. Only 10% of rural Americans, 10% of rural Americans get more than 25% of their income from agriculture. And so this is another issue where you see the ag industry groups sort of speaking on behalf of all rural Americans, when in fact most rural Americans work in healthcare, they work in education, they work in that service. You know, they provide services, health services, child and elderly care, things like that. Far more rural voters work in those industries than in agriculture. And I think that's a key to understanding rural voters, is to understand that, you know, yes, agriculture economies directly impact communities, but when it comes to people's day-to-day income, that's much more connected into things like healthcare and education.
That's so interesting. And also sort of segues to my next question. I mean, you've touched on it in everything that you've said already, but so last month you published an op-ed in the Storm Lake Times calling for Vice President Biden, if he's elected, to establish an Office of Rural Prosperity, an idea that's based on extensive polling conducted by your team. Can you tell us about a little more about what that would entail? And you sort of answered this already, but, you know, and why it's necessary?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Office of Rural Prosperity is actually an idea that came out of Kansas. The governor there, a Democrat, after she defeated Chris Kobach in the governor's race, one of the first things that she did was open an Office of Rural Prosperity. And I think that that was a very smart move on a number of fronts. One is to show that Democrats are fighting for rural people and rural economies. But two, because just the nature of our government, and going back to the civic deserts here again, but just the ability for rural communities to take advantage of government programs to, you know, revitalize downtown, to support their schools, to support local businesses. A lot of times it's really challenging for rural communities to take advantage of those programs. If you think about it, the town I lived in rural Iowa was 860 people in the whole town. There's, you know, condos, many condos that are bigger than the entire town. So you have, you know, all of these local folks trying to take advantage of these government programs. And so oftentimes those programs are just, you know, missed by the rural communities. And then when you look at the federal government, the bureaucracy at the federal government for rural programs is scattered across multiple agencies. It's in multiple program areas. Oftentimes it's run out of USDA, which once again assumes this agricultural bias, which obviously rural communities are also agriculture communities, and often, but not always. And so it's just a lot of these rural development projects and efforts have been, I think, there's the bureaucracy to take advantage of them is just really immense. So our idea is to create a centralized office where these programs can be focused on, and also that we can unify the strategy that's, all these different agency areas to have a real focus. Like right now, what happens is through our agriculture subsidies, we're over subsidizing monoculture agriculture. So, farmers are growing one crop and that's it. Well, that has a downstream effect on rural communities. So we subsidize the agriculture community, with millions and billions of dollars. But the way that we're subsidizing those communities results in population loss. It results in the consolidation of agri industries. And so then we have to spend, more money making sure that we can fix the problems created through those subsidies programs. And so it's just not a unified strategy. And I think we can have a strategy that, builds on itself. And what we say is we want to make sure that we're keeping rural dollars rural. Because what happens is let's say we subsidize agriculture, and well, that's good for the farmer. Back in the old days, the farmer would go into the locally owned hardware store and fix the tractor at the local mechanic. But now all of those industries have been consolidated. So they're going into Walmart, which is pulling the dollars out of the community, or they're going to John Deere, which is pulling the money out of the community. So this would be a more focused effort. And I think that that's something that we really, when we did our polling and our focus groups, it was very clear that rural people, only 10% of rural people thought that USDA programs benefit small businesses. So that's something that's a fairly high barrier. Have a focused effort. I think that'll have a big impact on those programs and who's benefiting from those programs.
That's so interesting. So, and going back to some of what you said earlier, that these stereotypes exist about people who live in rural areas, from both parties. Do you envision some of that dismantling of those stereotypes would be part of this Office of Rural Prosperity's mandate? And if so, where do you start to sort of tackle those stereotypes?
Yeah, so I think the clearest stereotype for that specifically is this idea that rural equals white. I mean, 1 in 5 rural voters are voters of color, people of color. And so when you look across the South, the Black community is a vital part of rural communities. When you look across the Great Plains and Midwest and West, you have the Native communities and the tribal communities that are critical members of rural America. And then scattered throughout the country are immigrant communities, often connected to agriculture. And so one of those things that I think, one of the stereotypes that I think we need to address is just this idea that if we're talking about rural voters, we're talking about white voters. That's definitely not the case. And I think that having a more unified approach to those different communities and addressing the unique challenges those communities are facing, I think is a key part of what I think is needed at the federal level. And then the other part of this is small business. We see that rural voters are I've started calling them small business populists. A lot of times, big industry sort of speaks on behalf of rural voters, and the true issues of rural voters actually are not being represented in our democracy. And so, so I think that having this focus on small business first is probably the most unifying thing we could do in rural communities. This idea of reinvesting in small business. If you're not from a rural community, we have this sort of 1950s vision of rural America, this Norman Rockwell vision of rural America, when in fact, so many storefronts are now empty. All the business is being conducted through, Walmart, which is one of the largest employers in rural America, or the dollar store. It's low-wage jobs that are just perpetuating these cycles of poverty. So I think kind of addressing those two issues first, recognizing that rural is not white, and then also having a real intense focus on small business over that corporate interest would go a long way in addressing these issues.
You mentioned tribal nations, so I want to focus on one of the questions that was submitted by a student prior to the event, and that student wasn't able to ask it live, so I'm going to attempt to ask it on her behalf. So this is Madeline Carey's question. Can you talk about voter outreach on tribal nations, and if your organization works on some of those very unique issues?
Yeah, so our organization is in partnership with a number of groups that are doing really amazing work in tribal communities and on reservations. So there's some groups in Montana that are doing excellent work. We always look to Montana. Montana always seems to be years ahead of everybody else. And so the work that's being done on those reservations has been amazing. I think last cycle we saw a lot of the work that was being done in the North Dakota tribal communities. This year, there's also a lot of work being done in Arizona, one of the largest populations in rural Arizona. Arizona, despite the fact that it's a big desert in a lot of places, it's a very urban state. But the rural communities that do exist in Arizona are often connected to the Navajo Nation, and so the work on the Navajo reservations is really impressive this year as well. And this goes to when you look at the voter suppression efforts, I think that actually shows how important these rural communities of colors are for shaping the outcome of elections. Like, they would not be targeted for voter suppression efforts if they didn't matter. And I think that that's just more evidence of the role that communities of color in rural America play for picking who is elected.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So 2 more questions submitted by students, and then I want to totally change gears for my last question. So this is submitted by Ava Sakamoto. How do you prevent or reduce burnout when you're organizing, particularly when organizing has really changed in COVID and we're all staring at a screen every day? And in some ways, I think you've got to work twice as hard to connect people remotely. So, what are your tips and tricks?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I would say plan for burnout, and don't think it's something that can be prevented. I think that it will happen no matter what. So it's best to plan for it. I think that sometimes it's really hard to have like a hobby or to be able to turn off the work. And that's something that I think is absolutely important. It's hard to do, obviously, in October before an election this year, but really making space for being intentional about self-care and just recharging, I think, is really important. And I think that's also important, not just on a day-to-day basis, but also for longer periods of time. The last 4 years have been, I started 2016 working in the immigrant rights movement, and so that was a movement that was continuously under attack, and so and now we're doing this work. So it's been a long 4 years. But one thing that I've really tried to do is just plan for that burnout, make space, take time off. But then also, I think focusing on small local wins is something that I would also recommend. Even if you're working on national politics, I think especially if you're working on national politics, getting involved at the local level where you can actually see change happen, I think, at a much quicker rate. We've been fighting for, pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants for 30 some years now, and you can burn out really quick if that's all you're focused on. But if you're focused on local policy wins at the local level, I think that is there's a reward in that, and it's easier to see the work pay off.
Yeah, totally. So this question was submitted by Stephen Alkesta. Hopefully I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. Do you have any advice for avoiding backlash or resentment when advocating for potentially polarizing progressive issues?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that some of that comes in through in values framing. So it's always important to establish when you're working on something, before what you're talking about, what the policy is, or how you're going to achieve it, to talk about why you're working on it, connecting with values first, answering that question of why do I care about something is often more important than anything else. And then also I will say that often messengers are the message. And so if you're thinking about how you engage communities, having authentic spokespeople, representatives, ambassadors, whatever, from those communities goes a long, long ways. So if we just set up progressive issues as a urban idea, the backlash is always going to be stronger in rural communities. And I think that sometimes we buy into this division, and I think that often those divisions are intentional. And I think that we have to, it's easy to see it when the division is happening on the other side, but sometimes we have to check our own stereotypes, and we assume that we're fighting with somebody. And I think that's something that can really backfire from this. Like I've stopped trying to just say Republicans do this, but really be focusing on which Republicans am I talking about, because so many people in rural areas are Republican that agree with me. And so when I just say Republicans do this or Republicans think that, it's just perpetuating this division instead of talking about the leaders that are sort of dividing and distracting us and preventing any sort of real progress from happening.
Yeah, I know. As we all start thinking about Thanksgiving and what that holiday will look like for a lot of us with COVID, I'm already thinking of how to utilize some of these tips when talking to my own family about political issues. So my last question, and then we'll get some folks up on screen to ask you questions directly, and changing gears totally. So before joining ruralorganizing.org, and Matt T mentioned this in his intro, you worked in a bunch of different roles with America's Voice, where you led a team dedicated to fighting white nationalism and white supremacy. So as I'm sure you know, because you were watching, in last week's presidential debate, President Trump would not condemn white supremacy, even when he was directly asked to do so by Chris Wallace. That moment really hurt, and it was quite shocking, I think, for a lot of people. And then in another way, not shocking. So how do individuals and organizations fighting against white supremacy on the front lines even, react to a statement like that on the ground level? And really, as someone who's doing that work or has done that work, what's the fallout from that moment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I started ruralorganizing.org as I was still at America's Voice. This was a passion project of mine. It was kind of a side project. And it was just so evident based on the work I was doing. I moved from DC back to where my family's from, actually in Northwest Iowa, in this area, kind of in the tri-state area around South Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, called Siouxland. So I moved back to be closer to family, and I was living in Steve King's congressional district. And Steve King was, or soon to be was, a member of Congress that has always been a white nationalist. And it was actually during the DREAM Act vote in 2011, late 2010, where I was up in the chambers, and the House was going to vote on the DREAM Act, and which is a piece of legislation that would recognize that undocumented youth are fully part of the United States and all but paperwork, so it would give them a pathway to citizenship. And a bunch of my friends were there, and they're undocumented, and here comes Steve King and starts saying this vile rhetoric about these undocumented people. And that was kind of when it clicked to me of like, only so much change can happen out of Washington, D.C. We have to go, change our own communities, move back because of other reasons as well. But spent a lot of the first couple of years really focusing on the overlap between rural areas and white nationalism, white supremacy. And I will say so much has changed back then. I mean, Steve King's rhetoric has not changed, but the way that the country, and especially voters, Republican voters in his own district have responded has changed dramatically since 2016. And so it was almost like they started saying, kind of the white nationalist groups started saying out loud what they only used to say, quietly amongst each other. And there was a real strong backlash to that. So with Steve King, for example, Republicans this last cycle ran a Republican in the primary and defeated Steve King in the primary. That was unthinkable back in 2015. I mean, Steve King ran that district. He could do whatever he wanted there, but he had a revolt against his white supremacy, his white nationalism, just among those Republicans. Now, I think the new Republican still has major issues but there's something to be said about the Republicans sort of just getting rid of it. I wish that we saw that more from Republicans at the national level. I mean, to think that local Republicans are the ones that are doing this in Iowa. Meanwhile, so many Republicans have sat on the sidelines with Trump. So I think that's frustrating, but there is something to be said about the backlash that Trump is seeing to these comments. These dog whistle politics have been around, you know, the racism has been around for years, forever. And now for him to say it so plainly, is, I think, really turning off a lot of voters. So it's scary to see it so out in the open, and it's very concerning to see it so out in the open. But I think that if Donald Trump loses in November, this broad coalition that includes rural people, it includes suburban people, it includes you know, people in the cities, it's communities of color, it's white people. There's just been a 60%, 65% rejection of that rhetoric among the country. And so I hope that that's something that, you know, those of us that are fighting white supremacy, white nationalism, I think that we can take some comfort in, is that that this stuff has been around forever. It's just now they're saying it out in the open, and there's been a really strong backlash to it. So I think that's something we should think more about. One last thing I'll say on this front, because I think it's really important, the misinformation or the disinformation, the intentional use of misinformation in rural communities is something that I think we are underestimating. And that is something that the Patriot Front, Proud Boys, all these organized white nationalist groups are doing. I saw this in my own hometown. My hometown is in South Dakota, where I grew up, has been very quiet in terms of protests historically, but they had a really big Black Lives Matter protest. It was the first time I really saw my own community take a stand. And there was an intentional response from local white nationalists to try and get people to show up with guns, and to try and to really scare people. It was part of this bigger disinformation effort that was happening at the same time nationally, where everybody was creating these rumors that Antifa was going to storm these small towns. So I think that's really one of the biggest challenges as we look forward, is how do we fight this disinformation, especially that's coming through Facebook groups, and is specifically in response to I think some of the changing sentiments around a more inclusive country.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I have about 1 million follow-up questions, but I'd rather hear from the folks who are asking questions now during the Q&A. So I want to segue to Stephen Colti, who's the Tufts alum and actually taught a course for Tufts students a few years ago through Tisch College. So hi, Steve. It's great to see you. I think you're muted. Matt H., can you hear him?
Nope.
Okay, no. Steve, do you want to, here, let me read your question for you. I don't know what the issue is. So the question he submitted was, what prospects do you see for improving rural broadband access in post-COVID America?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think, and honestly, this is something that is not just a rural issue. I mean, we see this in places like Cleveland and other areas as well. I mean, the digital divide is real. And in some ways, I think actually the rural digital divide has gotten more attention than some of these urban digital divide legacy issues that still exist. But I will say I think it's been another wake-up call for communities. I know I have a friend back home in Iowa that they had to set up, they had to get the Wi-Fi expanded outside of their little, just a one-room library, because they knew so many of the kids were going to be, studying from home, and so people would have to pull their cars up in order to get Wi-Fi through the library when the library was closed. So I think that this is something that is re-raising the issue. I think that rural broadband is, always is kind of on the top of people's minds, but especially as we start looking at some of the policies that need to come out to get the economy going again, I think broadband is going to always be part of those conversations, and I think that's a good thing, because if you look, especially in Appalachia, especially when you look at some of these more remote communities. People are still on dial-up, and it's it's like 25 years in the past. And so I think that's something that we absolutely will be addressing as we move forward.
Thank you for that. Thanks, Steve. Sorry we couldn't hear you. But Martin, you're up next. Oh, you're muted.
I'm now unmuted.
Yeah.
First of all, as a proud Tufts alum, thanks for this great program on rural organizing. I also love the question on rural broadband. That's one of the issues I work on at AARP, and just folks should really check out an op-ed in Slate magazine from Jeb Bush. He just came out really big in favor of that. But my question is, where do you see older folks fitting in your rural organizing? Statistics tell us that rural populations are disproportionately older.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's absolutely true. We just did this is a funny story. We just did a big concert, co-hosted it or co-sponsored it with a group called Hood to the Holler from Kentucky. And I thought we had some of the biggest names in music playing. We had like Jason Isbell and Bright Eyes and Phoebe Bridgers and all these other people participating in this concert. And our email list was like, I've never heard of these people. Why can't we get classical music? Which I think they were joking, but it was also, fair point. Yeah, so I will say this is also, we do some work with like the indivisible chapters. Many of those groups are run by older people, often older women. I think whether it's politics or just kind of in general, that's a demographic that is just critical to rural communities. And so I think, in terms of progressive organizing, obviously like groups specifically focused on seniors would have higher densities of older people than we do. But we have an activist base, I would say, that's skews a little bit younger. But as a whole, our membership is definitely older. And if you see, like, especially when it came to healthcare and pushing back on the cuts that were going to come to the Affordable Care Act, all those fights were led by older folks. So they're absolutely a critical demographic in our network. And there's some specific groups that are doing organizing specifically for older people. There's a group in Montana that's focusing on 55 plus and others. And so I think that's a great question, and I think you're absolutely right. It's a very critical demographic that's doing really cool stuff. Frankly, a lot of the really cool organizing is happening from older folks in our network.
Thank you.
I think we have another. Here we go. Go ahead.
All right.
Oh, sorry, you're muted.
Now, so sorry for that. Okay, hi, my name is V, and so I'm currently a senior at Oregon Episcopal School, which is in Portland, Oregon, which is very famous for its like liberal bubble, I guess, like in the middle of a somewhat of like a swing/wet state, I guess, which is a really interesting situation. So my question kind of concerned the same, I guess, that same like situation is that, well, what does extremist like media bubble looks like in rural area that you have worked in? Because, well, for example, for me, I recognize that I'm surrounded by this like literal bubble, and it's like it has been like obviously like a journey to kind of like just navigate like all these like information and things like that. So what does like extremists, especially if it's like more conservative side, more right-leaning side, like media bubble looks like in rural area, and how has you and your team been able to tackle that issues, I guess is my question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And this once again ties back to the civic deserts and the decline of local media sources. So our polling shows that actually more rural voters get their news from Facebook than Fox News, which is something that I think we need to think more about. And so I think the fact that Facebook has started taking steps, I think they're small steps, but they're steps to ensuring authentic accounts and making sure that there's not voter suppression efforts happening through the platform, I think has been a really a good improvement. And I think there's still a lot more that needs to be done there, but we're moving in the right direction. And that's where I think, especially when you think of, or you say extremists, that's where I think most of the extremist content is coming from. A lot of times it's hard to identify the source of it, Oftentimes it seems to be just random people posting these memes, but when you look into it, they're actually memes that are being reposted and, you know, signal boosted and all this other stuff. It's like they actually have a pretty sophisticated network. And so that, I think, is the first thing that comes to mind, especially when you talk about bubbles. I mean, you could be two people living in the same town could be seeing completely different information from Facebook based on, you know, what they're likely to engage with. So those bubbles, it's not just a town bubble, but it's like a bubble that's over one person. It's like literally an individual bubble. And so that's a real challenge. And I think that fighting that challenge, I mean, we're still trying to figure that out. I do know, and this is based on own personal experience and some other research that we've done, that it's trying to get people to connect with each other. Like there's a weird dynamic now where people are more likely to trust somebody they don't know on social media but agree with than somebody they do know but disagree with. And that dynamic is really, I think, destroying the fabric of our country. So I don't really know whether it's Thanksgiving dinner or whatever, but we have to get people re-engaging with each other and having those community conversations. And we've had some success with that. The other thing I'll say is there's a real lack of content in rural America for progressives. So, you know, if you lean to the right and you tend to be, you know, more conservative in the media you're looking for, there's kind of an endless buffet for you to choose from of content. But on the left, there's just not a lot of content out there or content that focuses on social cohesion. So that's something that we're trying to address as well. Then the last thing I'll say is that I think we need to focus a little bit more on local journalists. Sometimes, and I saw this around the misinformation campaign that we were fighting back in June. Sometimes local media was the first to spread misinformation or sort of fall for that disinformation perpetuated online. So like in my hometown, a bunch of local media outlets were talking, they just signal boosted all of these rumors that Antifa was coming to destroy businesses. And actually trying to get the local media to report what was true was a challenge. And it was really discouraging to see how quickly they would fall for these right-wing rumors, but then convincing them that not only is Antifa not coming to your community to destroy your windows, but in fact you fell for a white nationalist rumor was really challenging. So I think efforts focusing on that education to local journalists is going to be important, especially I think local television.
Okay, Jenna, you're up next. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, we all keep doing that. I'm Jenna. I'm a PhD student in civil and environmental engineering here at Tufts. First of all, thanks for this conversation. I think these are really important talks to have. I grew up in a small town in New York, so I think you kind of hit the nail on the head in these rural communities that feel like they can't be part of the political process. Obviously, New York not being a swing state, and so I think people feel like they don't have a voice. And even when programs are developed to help rural America, I feel like sometimes there's a disconnect between communicating the benefits and sometimes there's a backlash. So property taxes going up is much more apparent than population growth and business coming back and things like that. So I guess my question is, how can we better involve the rural communities in setting the agenda for rural development?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think you're exactly right. Everybody knows this is, you know, their taxes going up, but it takes a couple of years for sometimes those benefits to come back. I think that's a real challenge. And interesting, we did some focus groups around rural development, and just the term rural development can be alienating to rural people because they hear rural development and they think that means turning their small town into a bigger city. And so they think instead of sort of, you know, stay here and thrive, it's like we want to develop your community into something that it's not. There's a lot of I think conceptions around just that term. I think rural prosperity, I don't know that we have the right term for what we're really talking about, but it's, you know, that Sonny Perdue, the ag secretary, now talks about getting big or get out. And that notion is, I think, really harmful to rural communities. And sometimes just that word development sort of evokes that feeling of like, well, maybe we want our community to stay small. Like, we don't want to be in a big city or bigger city. So I think that's an important part of it. If you look at, I think there's 2 governors that have done a really good job on incorporating rural people into the civic conversations. One is in Kansas, the other one is in Wisconsin. Both of those states have state offices of rural prosperity. And that's why I think I'm so interested in a federal office of rural prosperity, because the 2 governors in those states are going around the state and actually before COVID, we're actually going around. I think now it's through Zoom and other efforts. And just doing listening tours. And so, for example, a big issue in rural areas is like septic tanks or like propane tanks or like sand points. Like these are all things that like rural people talk about on a day-to-day basis, and policy impacts those things. But like politicians aren't running around talking about septic tanks. And so there's these rural issues that are just actually never addressed through elected officials. And I think there's, those are 3 just to top of mind, but school consolidation in schools, like having an actual strategy about when a school shuts down and when you combine school districts together, or when you try and keep your own schools locally would be another example. And so I think that those conversations are often kind of pushed off into a small group of rural only people, but I think bringing those into the actual conversation through these listening tours is a good piece of it. And then also connecting, like a lot of the school issues that we face in rural communities are very similar to the issues we face in urban areas. Food deserts is a big thing, and ironically enough, in rural communities, even rural communities with high industrial agriculture. And so how do we bridge the gap and create this rural-urban coalition? I think the more that we can do that, the more we can address these issues.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask one question that was submitted through the Q&A, and Catherine asked that we asked it on her behalf. So Catherine Hausman, who's a Tufts alum, asks, I live in Northwest Tennessee, Bristol, and we have had large, peaceful Black Lives Matter protests, but it has not translated into more Democrats on the ballot. Everyone here seems afraid of the Trump supporters who have suppressed wages and opportunity here for a decade. Confederate flags fly from pickup trucks. Signs of hope include 100 people showed up to a recent event for our Democratic candidates, and swag is flying out of the Democratic headquarters. How do we capture this energy and move forward?
It's a great question. I think the point about the Black Lives Matter protesters is really important. There was a protest in Northwest Iowa, and the Facebook event said 400 people were going to show up. It was a town of maybe 9,000 people. And I thought, there's no way. I organized in that community for 5 years. There's no way that 400 people are showing up in this town. And sure enough, I think they exceeded that. And I kind of had set my expectations too low. I think the moment has really turned. Even on just Black Lives Matter, NASCAR and a bunch of country musicians, to use rural stereotypes, like even the rural stereotypical stuff are coming out in support of Black Lives Matter, which I think is a testament to the Black Lives Matter movement, and how much they've moved the needle on the conversation. So I think that's important to note. I think the question you have about capturing that momentum is something we've thought through quite a bit. And we've tried to, we actually have a network of rural leaders. We try to actually proactively go out and find them that are hosting these rallies and just connect with them, see what sort of resources they need, see what sort of ideas they have. We've actually brought them in to get out the vote efforts as well. And I think that's something that we really need to be intentional about. Some of this goes to chapter-based advocacy, which is really hard for rural communities. We're used to sort of, this town has this chapter, this town has that chapter, which is great in terms of long-term sustainability. But you also have, I've heard them called like blue geysers, where it's sort of in this moment, this town is popping, but because of the lack of infrastructure, there's no way to capture that. So I think that's really intentional. I will say, I think we have to do it online. That's kind of our focus. We have a big Facebook group for organizers across the country. They interact with each other and they engage each other, give each other advice. It doesn't come from the top down. It's really a grassroots thing. So I think we need to do that as well. The other thing I will say, because you mentioned rural swag, yard signs for the last 5 years, or maybe 10 years, somebody did a report that said yard signs don't impact elections. And I think we've seen, especially in rural communities, we actually did a big, pretty sophisticated field experiment in 2019 in Kentucky. And we saw that, I think, that yard signs do have an impact in rural communities, especially when they're in people's yards. And so we need to be, I think, resourcing these communities in general. So I think that's where the strong network needs to come from. That's why we've really focused on a network rather than connecting as a coalition with this organization or that organization. We really are focused on people no matter where they're at, getting plugged in and getting the resources that they need. So for anybody that's interested, checking out ruralorganizing.org, we have a host of resources on our website. One of the resources was planning a Black Lives Matter protest in your community. So that's one of the ways that we're trying to capture those.
Well, with that, we're reaching the end of our program, and I just want to thank you for your time today. I know I learned so much, and I know everybody watching in the Zoom room and on YouTube as well has learned a great deal. Thank you for the critical work that you're doing to bring diverse voices into the fold of such an important conversation. So with that, thank you for your time. Good luck with the election coming up, and thanks to all who are watching.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.